Missile Crisis, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation between the USSR and the US on the island of Cuba. Placed in the center of the Caribbean, the emergence of a communist state means that the USSR finally has gone on the offensive and pinned a critical strike against the US heartland. Thus, to counter this, in April 1961, under the initiative of the CIA, the Bay of Pigs invasion was launched, ending in a disaster as CIA operations were uncoordinated and disorganized. After June 1961, the United States began an extensive campaign of terror against civilian and military targets on the island. In February 1962, an embargo was launched on Cuba by the US.
May 1962. Khrushchev decides to play ballistic missiles on Cuba for 4 major reasons. Number 1, the Soviet had no ICBM parity with America at the time, only 20 in stockpile. He wanted to bring West Berlin into the Soviet sphere of influence, to counter the American campaign of terrorism on Cuba in defense, and to level the playing field of the United States and establishing mutually assured destruction between the two nations. On 7th of July, the final decision was made and Soviet missile troops deployed to Cuba. In August 1962, U.S. discovered possible missile sites via U-2 spy planes, and the first Soviet MRBMs deployed on 8th September 1962. On 15th October, the CIA identifies MRBMs on Cuba, and the U.S. blockades Cuba on 22nd of October 1962, and a Tactical Air Command was placed on alert.
26th of October, Kennedy considers war. Soviets offer negotiation. A secret letter was sent by Khrushchev. 27th of October, a U-2F spycraft was shot down. Nuclear launch nearly avoided by the crew of the Soviet submarine B-59. Saturday, 27th in October, Khrushchev again sends letters offering negotiation. The USSR backs down. Khrushchev was to remove the missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy would secretly remove those in Turkey. November 1962, Soviet nuclear forces withdraw. October 1964, Khrushchev was overthrown in the coup due to his weakness he demonstrated in the crisis.
The crisis thus concluded with an American victory. The Soviets were publicly humiliated in front of their allies, further accelerating the Sino-Soviet split and contributed significantly to Khrushchev's downfall from power, in addition to his failed agricultural policy and increasing reliance on Western goods. The figure that replaced him, Leonid Brezhnev, started the nearly 30 years of industrial, social, and political stagnation that would eventually lead to the failed perestroika reforms and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc.
Alright, and now we will see what would happen if the Cuban Missile Crisis has gotten way out of hand. So now what would have likely happened is after the Soviets would have sent the missiles to Cuba and the US decided to do their big funny naval blockade, what likely would have happened according to these two men's temperaments was probably that Nikita Khrushchev would have been very angry at the US and then would have felt like blowing it up. So then what would have happened is he probably would have sent a bunch of missiles directly onto the US mainland, forcing the US to retaliate. And then it will also probably lead into a global destruction. Now, thankfully, this didn't happen because in this universe, world leaders aren't as out of their minds as I like to picture them to be. So, yeah, that's our presentation. Have fun.